Why do the elites want a race war? That's the question I'm going to be addressing in this episode of the What's Wrong with America podcast. I'm your host, Daniel D. It is January 29th, 2022, a beautiful Saturday. What better time to talk about racism and anti-racism and what exactly is going on? You know, what is it the elites are up to? Why do they want a race war? And of course, when I ask that question, I'm assuming that they do want a race war. But looking at the thinkers, writers, speakers, that the elite class, have endorsed and told us we need to listen to and that need to be given charge of our institutions and need to teach us, how to be better people. Looking at those thinkers and groups, you get a sense of what the elites want to happen. And then you ask, well, you look at these people, and if we implement their ideas, it's not going to lead to a future in which people of all races are reconciled and getting along and functioning together well in society, and everybody's flourishing together and working for a common good for humanity apart from the amount of melanin you have in your skin, And so you got to ask the question, well, what is it that the elites get out of this? And before I begin, I just want to thank our sponsors. This podcast is brought to you by Libsyn, the Liberated Syndicate. If you want to podcast and you've been looking for an opportunity to do that, you can get up to 2 free months of podcast hosting. Just go to signup.libsyn.com. Put a link in the show notes and use promo code DanielD to get up to 2 free months of podcast hosting, or you can just use the link in the show notes and it'll already be in there with the promo code and everything, so you can get your 2 free months of podcast hosting. Give it a shot. If you got something to say and you don't really care if nobody else is listening to you, like me, well, then go for it. Also, this show is brought to you by a reading list. I'm going to put links, their affiliate links to Amazon in the show notes. Of course, I understand if you don't want to support Jeff Bezos and his evil empire. Unfortunately, it's hard to get some of these books if you don't go to Amazon, but I suppose there are alternatives. But I'm going to put affiliate links to Amazon in the show notes. So, if you want to click on those affiliate links to do your Amazon shopping, a small percentage of that at no cost to you will be kicked back to me. And anyway, these books are going to be worth checking out. I'm going to talk about them later. One thing that I really want to tell you need to check out if you haven't already, which is The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense by Gad Saad. Putting that affiliate link in the show notes, as well as The True Believer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements by Eric Hoffer, which is also a great book, talks about the psychology of mass movements and really helps to explain a lot of what we're seeing today. But anyway, that's the sponsor, if you will, or sponsors of this great podcast. So back to what I was saying. Why do the elites want a race war? Something that is really interesting to see is if you compare the racial leaders, the civil rights leaders of the past with the civil rights, in air quotes, the civil rights leaders of today, you notice some differences. Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., these guys were not celebrated by the elites at the time. At least in their day, they weren't. They weren't giving speeches to Wall Street bankers for 6 figures a pop. The biggest Fortune 500 companies weren't inviting them, and paying their organization millions of dollars to give seminars on anti-racism. They weren't, being funded by, billionaire, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or whatnot. They weren't getting the approval, the endorsement, the backing of the elites running society. Why? Because they actually were preaching a message that the elites did not want people to hear. They were preaching a message that cut against the elites and the elites' agenda, right? But compare that to today. The most powerful people in society, the billionaire class, the bankers, the leaders of big institutions in government, in the private sector, foundations, with endowments in the billions of dollars, Ivy League institutions with endowments in the billions of dollars. These are the types of people that are telling us Americans that we need the ideas and reforms of, Ibram X. Marxist Botkendi or Robin DiAngelo, that we need Black Lives Matter Incorporated, that these are the future, that we need to let them implement policies to enact the sorts of things that they envision bringing about. It makes you wonder, well, why would the elites want that? Like, let's take a step back and look at countercultural figures throughout history, right? Jesus of Nazareth, right? I don't recall reading that Jesus wrote, a book on how to be an anti-Romanist or how to be an anti-Pharisee that was promoted by the Jerusalem Times and, number one bestseller. And, I don't recall Jesus being invited by the Pharisees or the Sadducees to give speeches and get paid, more than what the typical day laborer would make in a decade to give a speech about how evil the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. I don't recall that, I don't recall Pontius Pilate endorsing Jesus of Nazareth and telling people that he needs to read the book and having, Jesus come and give anti-Romanist seminars for the Roman legions, right? I don't recall the commanders of the Roman army saying that they needed to understand Jewish rage and inviting Jesus to teach them and demanding that the officers in the Roman army, the centurions, would read Jesus's writings. I don't recall that happening. I mean, it seems like they persecuted Jesus, wanted him in prison, wanted him put to death, That's usually kind of what happens when you're preaching a message that the elites don't like. Like if you really look at society and you're saying society is not just. There are real evils in society. We need to change society. If you're serious, the people that run that society who are benefiting from the existing institutions and power structures, they don't like that. They don't endorse you. They don't support you. They don't pay you to promote. They don't platform you. No, they kill you. They throw you in prison. They malign you, slander you. You get the nonstop propaganda machine churning, out lies against you. That's what happens when people really are revolutionary in a way that is on the side of ordinary people and against the elites. Do we see today that pattern with the so-called civil rights leaders of the present age? We don't. And I'll tell you on a personal level, okay, I know identity is supposed to validate what you say nowadays, right? Like you're supposed to tell people I'm a cis white male and therefore I can speak only on how racist I am. But let me get a trans, Asian female to tell you all about what you need to know about things, So I'm going to tell you, I'm a cis white male, whatever the hell cis means. But I have black biracial children. And so I don't put that out there to say, I can't possibly be a racist. Yeah, I know Strom Thurmond had a black biracial daughter, and he was pretty racist, So I'm not saying that. But unlike Strom Thurmond, I acknowledge my black biracial kids. I'm raising them actively. I put the biggest ring I could not afford on their mother's, finger. Got married to her for a number of years. Didn't work out, but, I love my children. And I recognize that when things really are terribly racist in society, when there's a lot of racial violence, it's not a good thing, especially for biracial people, right? If you're trying to fragment society along racial lines and get people hyper conscious of their racial identity, and you're trying to make sure that rights and privileges are assigned or denied based on racial identity, it's not a good thing for anybody. And I don't see that as a good thing for my black biracial children. So for me, that's my angle as to why I care about this issue. I don't think that the people who support Ibram X. Factor Kendi or Black Lives Matter Incorporated have really thought through this, exactly what this means if those groups are successful in fomenting the type of racial division and animosity that they're after. If you have a group say black people, 13% of the population, starting a race war ain't a good idea, because and I'm saying this from a pragmatic perspective of, if you're a minority and you see society as being so irredeemably racist and you want to push people into these camps where they're identifying solely based on race and advancing their political agenda based on their racial identity, that's not a winning strategy if you're a minority. Because if the majority of people are white and you're pushing an identity politics based on race, if you're successful, that's not going to lead to a good place. It's going to lead to a backlash. It's kind of one of those Newtonian physics type of like every action produces an equal and opposite reaction. I'm sure I'm butchering that quote, but basically, if you tell white people, working class white people, over and over and over again, you're evil, you're irredeemably evil, you need to give up your privilege. And in the reality, those working class white people are doing worse and worse every year. And maybe everybody is. Maybe that's kind of, as we're moving toward this great reset where 2030, welcome to 2030, as the World Economic Forum has publicly tweeted, publicly proclaimed, welcome to 2030. You will own nothing and have no privacy, and life will never be better. It's like quoting, or first person tweet from the World Economic Forum. Multiple times they've quoted this and tweeted it out. Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better. That's the vision that they have for us. So anyway, as we move towards this great reset, maybe everybody's going to be doing worse, including working class whites. Well, maybe not elites, but the working class whites, along with working class people of every other race, doing worse and worse, feeling like they own less and less, have more and more debt, have less and less privacy, have less and less options, right? And you're telling them this whole time, no, you guys are really actually very privileged, don't you know? You guys are really the cause of all the problems. You need to give up more of your privilege so that other people can have a fair shake, right? It's like if you imagine a zoo and you have different animals in the zoo and you have the zookeeper going around and telling the zebras, oh, look at the giraffe. Those guys are so privileged. Look at how big their enclosure is. You guys, your enclosure isn't that big. They get more hay than you get, or they get more leaves to eat than you get. They're privileged. Those are your enemy right there. And these zebras are like, yeah, that's right. Their enclosure is bigger than ours. Their building is bigger. Maybe it's because their necks are bigger, but their buildings are taller. Our enclosure isn't that big. This isn't right. Let's riot. Let's protest, right? Meanwhile, the zookeeper goes home to his nice house. He's free when he leaves the zoo, and you're still in your cage. Even if you trade places, even if the zebras succeed in agitating to be given the giraffe's enclosure, and the giraffes are moved over to the zebra's enclosure, right? Guess what? You're still in a cage. The zookeeper who's doing all this agitating and moving people around, they're free. They're not in a cage. So it ought to make you a little suspicious when you're looking at who's telling you that this is the enemy over here and you need to fight them. They're the enemy. You need to take their privilege away from them so that you can, so that you can be right. Who's giving that message? And who's the enemy under that regime, right? So you got the elites, the Wall Street bankers, the billionaire classes, the leaders of, big federal government agencies, big nonprofits and Ivy League institutions and foundations and community activist groups and all that. You got the elite class telling you, yep, listen to Ibram Kendi. Listen to Robin DiAngelo. Listen to Black Lives Matter. Let them riot. Because rioting is the voice of the unheard. Didn't Martin Luther King say that? I mean, yeah, he said a few other things, and kind of we're going to take that out of context and just so it can look like we're getting Martin Luther King, the nonviolent civil rights leader, to sign off on these riots, because they're mostly peaceful. A few buildings get burned down, a few mom and pop stores get shuttered for good. But, it's mostly peaceful. Who benefits from that? Who is the one who's in the cage? And who's the one who's not in a cage, Are the Wall Street bankers more like the zookeeper in the analogy of the zebras and the giraffes? Are DNC leaders, Biden cabinet officials, editors at the New York Times, CNN anchors, are they more like the zookeeper or more like the zebras or the giraffe? And the broke-ass white people living in, middle America in a single wide trailer, out of work because the coal mine closed or the manufacturing plant closed. Their jobs have been outsourced overseas or shut down because of the Green New Deal, right? They're broke. They're addicted to opiates. They don't have anything. They're one of the people who's going to own nothing and have no privacy and yet somehow be expected to be happy, right? Those broke-ass white people in middle America, they're the enemy? They're the ones holding everybody down? They're the reason why people in, the inner city, minority communities living in the inner city are living in disproportionate poverty or, over-policed or whatever. They're the reasons? It's to benefit the people living in single wide trailers in Appalachia that all this is going on. It doesn't have anything to do with hedge funds, Wall Street banks, nothing at all. And that's the thing. Even if you knew nothing else about Ibram Kendi or Black Lives Matter Incorporated, even if you didn't know that Patrisse Cullors, this co-founder of Black Lives Matter, a self-proclaimed Marxist, a supposed revolutionary, even if you didn't know that she was buying multi-million-dollar real estate all over the fucking world and country, even if you didn't know that, it ought to make you wonder about Black Lives Matter Incorporated, that they get the endorsement of the powerful elite in our society. If our society is so irredeemably racist, then doesn't that mean that the people running our society are irredeemably racist? And if they're irredeemably racist, why are they endorsing Black Lives Matter Incorporated, who's preaching that very message? Could it be possibly that Black Lives Matter Incorporated, Ibram X Factor Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, and others of that ilk are the, useful idiots of the elite? Could it be that, they're getting basically paid off to sow division among their own people, to create division among the working poor in this country? Could it be that this is a divide and conquer strategy among the elites? Let's look at this, for example. Let's go back to Kenosha, Wisconsin, right? That's not that long ago, 2020. Jacob Blake. Here's what the media told us happened. And by the media, I mean like CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Oh, and our great propagandist in chief over at The Daily Show, Trevor Noah, who retired from comedy to pursue political propaganda full time. This is what they told us happened. Jacob Blake, great guy, goes over, to break up a fight between two women. The police are called. They come. And even though he's there trying to do the right thing, trying to keep these two women from fighting, they turn on him. And as he's walking away peacefully, they just shoot him in the back for no reason because they hate black people. That's the story that we got. The reality, no, Jacob Blake was not there to break up a fight between two women. He was there in defiance of a restraining order against him by the woman who called the police, a woman whom he had previously sexually assaulted and raped, and he was there to kidnap children. That's what he was in the act of doing, driving away with children unlawfully, that, defying a restraining order. The woman who had the restraining order called the police. They come. They're faced with the situation. Jacob Blake is trying to leave with these children that will amount to kidnapping. Now, are the police supposed to just let him do it? Just let him go. Just let him take those kids. We'll worry about it later. And this is after he's fought with the police physically, shrugged off, being tased, and now he's going to his car and reaching in and retrieving a knife. That's what happened. And then the police shoot him. Okay? Doesn't matter. Facts don't matter when you're advancing a narrative. So predictably, Black Lives Matter Incorporated sponsors all hell breaking loose, riots, Do they burn down the police station to protest the actions of the police? No. They burn down mom and pop stores, small businesses owned by regular people. Not just white, but Indian, black, Hispanic. Burn it down, right? And our wonderful vice presidential candidate at the time, since has become vice president, Kamala Harris contributes to the bailout fund for these BLM and Antifa rioters. She calls Jacob Blake a hero. She and Joe Biden both endorsing Jacob Blake and his side of the story. And then, in the midst of all this chaos, we get the whole Rittenhouse affair, where the mainstream media tells you white supremacist crosses state lines with an assault rifle to murder peaceful protesters protesting for Black Lives Matter. He's killing black people, right? Nope. Didn't kill a single black person. The people he shot was white. And he actually didn't travel across state lines with an assault rifle. He didn't have the gun with him. He actually lives, it's a short drive from Kenosha, from his house. His dad lives in Kenosha. He's got family and ties to Kenosha. And he's there. Maybe it's unwise on his part. If he was my kid, I would have told him don't go. But he went, And in the course of that, he's attacked. If he wanted to go there and shoot people, he had plenty of opportunity to do it. When the people threaten him and then back down, he doesn't shoot them. He finally shoots after shots are fired by the BLM Antifa crew. And he only shoots the people who are pursuing him, who are trying to take away his gun, who are trying to hit him with the skateboard or whatever. A mob that's trying to take away his gun. And what do you think would have happened? Because they've already told him that they wait till they catch him alone, they're going to kill him. Another guy, Grosskreutz, who did have a gun illegally and said that he had wanted to empty his whole magazine into Rittenhouse, is shot in self-defense. Now, he's not a bad guy, but Rittenhouse is, right? Now, think about all of that. This is the discrepancy between facts and the narrative. And you got to ask, who benefits from advancing this narrative in opposition to the facts? Who benefits from sowing division among the working class people? Who benefits from inciting so many working poor people or non-working poor people to go out and riot and burn shit down and primarily burn down businesses owned by regular people? Even if they burn down a Target, even if they loot and burn down a Target, if they burn down Target and they burn down 50 mom and pop stores, who's going to rebuild their business? Who's going to survive with their business intact? Target may lose a store, but they got insurance. They got lots of stores nationwide. They'll basically be all right. And you can always go online and order from them. Or you can order from Amazon, right? What about the mom and pop stores that got burned down, that had already been shuttered by COVID? Because they were non-essential businesses, unlike the big stores like Target, Home Depot, Walmart, Amazon. The mom and pop stores are not essential businesses, so they had to shut because of COVID. And then come these riots, that ensue after a false narrative is promoted by the elites and the media controlled by the elites, right? So who benefits from that? Is it working poor, whether black or white or Hispanic or whatever? Or is it the elites? You create a situation in which the working classes are fighting among themselves, calling each other evil, and the working class whites are demonized, and so they're upset because it's you guys are lying about us, you're lying about the situation, you're pointing everybody's anger towards us, and then the poor minority communities are all upset because they're struggling too, and then they've been told these are the enemy, they're fighting, they're keeping you down, these white privileged people, just like these mom and pop business owners, just like Kyle Rittenhouse, who was, by all accounts, a kid from a working class home. That's the enemy. That's the face of white supremacy. You don't even have to be white to be a white supremacist nowadays. You could be Larry Elder, born and raised in Compton, City of Compton, home of NWA, Snoop Dogg, and all that, right? Eazy-E, Ice Cube, and Larry Elder. And, Larry Elder disagrees with us? Well, he's the black face of white supremacy. Winsome Sears, Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. It may be a black face, but that's a white voice coming out. That's what our elites in the media tell us. Who benefits from that? From this idea that if you're black and you disagree with us, you're a sellout. You're not really black. I mean, President Biden said that, right? If you don't vote for him, you're not really black. You ain't black, right? So if you're black, it's not even enough. You got to be black and politically agitated on the side that they want you to be on. Or if you're white, the only way you can redeem yourself for your horrible identity, similar to what Chairman Mao did with the Cultural Revolution in China. You have these bad identities, and so it's like, you're white, you got this privilege, you're in league with Jefferson Davis and all these slave owners in the South and the Confederacy and all that. That's who you're linked up with, because those people, even though they're all dead and gone, and you may not be related to any of them, you may not even live in the South, but if you're white, you got the same melanin, same complexion or a similar complexion as those guys. So therefore, you share in all their wrongs and all their guilt. But if you want a good identity, you can have the identity of an ally, of a revolutionary. You can join Black Lives Matter or Antifa and riot and show that you're down for the cause. And then you're good. Just don't riot in the rich neighborhoods. Don't burn down a banker's mansion. Don't burn down, CNN headquarters. No, go and burn down the mom and pop stores. They may not even be owned by white people. It may be a black family that owns it, or it may be an Indian family that owns it. Doesn't matter. Burn it down. That's the enemy. That's the face of white supremacy. And then tune in to CNN for your marching orders and MSNBC. Read the New York Times. Read the Washington Post. Read the most storied and influential legacy media outlets. That's where you're going to get the information that's really revolutionary, that's going to help the working poor out. I mean, it just is, it's so patently absurd when you take a step back and look at it and look at just who's benefiting. What's the end game here? And so Ibram X. Kendi. Let's talk about this guy for a minute. I never was really a big fan of religious fiction, before. But then when I read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Factor Kendi, boy, oh boy. Let me tell you, religious fiction, I didn't realize how good it is. He's got some... Now, this guy must have passed his logic classes with flying colors, because this is just... Man, I mean, he's the new Aristotle when it comes to logic. Like the way he defines racism. What is racism? Did you want to know? I know there was an agreed upon definition that was pretty much common throughout most of human history, or at least American history, right? Of what racism is. A belief in the superiority of one race over another, a belief that one race or that people should be privileged or punished because of their membership in a given race. That was kind of the idea that's what racism was. But thankfully, we've got people like Ibram X. Files Kendi giving us the definition. What is racism? And this is direct quote from a chapter on definitions in How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X's and O's Kendi. So let's set some definitions, Ibram says. What is racism? Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Wow. I don't know what racist is, what racism or racist is. So tell me, Ibram. Racism is just policies and ideas that are racist. Boy, I still don't know what racism is, You told me that ideas and policies can be racist, but you haven't told me what it is to be racist. It's one of those things when you have a definition like that, it makes it easy to keep moving the goalpost and to say we look at all this racism, because he also says, there's also a direct quote from How to Be an Anti-Racist. Denial is the heartbeat of racism. Well, isn't that just awesome? Denial is the heartbeat of racism. So if you say, well, I don't think we're racist. Oh, you're denying it? Well, that's the heartbeat of racism. That just shows that you're racist. Okay. I don't want to be racist, so I'm not going to deny that we're racist. See, you just admitted we're racist. So there you go. I got you. Heads I win, tails you lose. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. What a great catch-22. That's the hallmark of good religious thinking right there, when it's not falsifiable. No amount of data, no amount of evidence can budge you from your position, because you've arrived at your conviction in advance of the evidence. And now you can filter out the evidence based on whether or not it conforms with your belief. Man, oh man, oh man, oh man. Good old Ibram X Factor Kendi. So one of the things that his agenda is, and this is how to be an anti-racist, the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Oh, great. So kind of like George Wallace, when he talked about segregation now, segregation forever. Ibram X's and O's Kendi is saying, discrimination now, discrimination forever. Boy, that sounds like the type of future where we're never going to get past race, where we're always going to have racial strife and racial division. If you're telling me that the only way to correct for this past discrimination is to discriminate right now, today, and the only way to address the discrimination that is going on today is for the future, that sounds a lot kind of like this formulation from 1984 where he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. And this is a great future we've got to look forward to. One where there's going to be discrimination, racial discrimination until the end of time. And yeah, Ibram Kendi, his idea for reforming American institutions is to set up a dictatorship of the proletariat. To have a Department of Anti-Racism, also known as DOA, conveniently enough, which is apt because it should be dead on arrival. But the Department of Anti-Racism that's going to not be elected, not going to be accountable to elected officials, not going to be political appointees. No, it's going to pre-clear any and all laws, policies, government actions at the state, local, or federal level. And make sure everything is anti-racist. Well, that sounds like a great future where there's going to be more freedom for everybody and less racial division and less racial animosity and more, people working together. Martin Luther King's dream about black children and white children holding hands and, saying together, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Yeah, having this unelected oligarchy standing atop society, telling us what we can and can't do, can and can't say, and not just policing the government actions, but policing the actions of private individuals and private organizations and private businesses. That's his vision. So, boy, that's also great to know. That they're going to be able to come in at any time and say, hey, sorry, your business is not appropriately anti-racist. It's leading to inequitable outcomes. And so we're going to have to take over. We're going to have to, make some changes to your business. Now, if it hurts your profit margin to the point that you go bankrupt, well, it's too bad. You don't have any recourse because you can't vote us out and you can't vote for people to, remove us from office. Nope. We are a fourth branch of government, more powerful than the Supreme Court. Wow. It's quite a future. Now, who benefits from that? Who benefits from more regulation, more red tape, more things that businesses and people and organizations have to comply with in order to operate? The mom and pop stores who don't have an HR department, who don't have lawyers on retainer, or the big Fortune 500 corporations, whose largest shareholders are these big hedge funds or mutual funds or whatever, i.e. the Wall Street banks, that have massive HR departments and massive legal departments and budgets for complying with these type of things, who's that going to help? Whose businesses are going to get put out of business and whose businesses are going to be left alone to flourish? You know, makes you wonder, geez, it's almost like the elites kind of like the future that Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and Black Lives Matter Incorporated are conspiring to bring about. It's almost like it works in their favor. I wonder if the working poor who are black or Hispanic or Asian or white, I wonder if any of them are going to benefit from this, you know? Doesn't seem so. I mean, we'll get to work for an anti-racist company that has lots of money in its budget for anti-racist programs, a huge HR department, and where if we say or do the wrong thing, express the wrong idea, ask the wrong question, commit a microaggression, we'll be fired and banished from society and never allowed to work again. Our social credit score will be dropped to 0 and we'll be basically living out a Black Mirror episode, you know. Right? That sounds like a great future for us working poor, you know, for us regular people. And here's what I would define, like regular versus elite. This is a question to ask yourself, whether you're elite or not. Are you able to influence legislation or the actions of a federal agency? Are you able to call up and get on the phone to speak with you, a U.S. congressman, a U.S. senator, and tell them, you know what, I don't like this new bill, but maybe I would like it if you would put this provision in there that's going to benefit, you know, the industry that I happen to be in. If you're able to do that, and believe it or not, there are people that can. If you're able, like Citibank, to send an email to Obama's team and say, hey, these are the list of people that we think would be acceptable members of your cabinet, and then get a cabinet that is drawn from the names on your list. If you can do that, you're elite. Okay? And if you can't do that, you're not elite. Pretty simple. But if you can't do that, you're not elite. If your only recourse is expressing your outrage on social media or emailing your congressman and getting some boilerplate response, you know, if that's your recourse and you go to work for somebody else for a living and they tell you how you can do your job, where and when you to do your job, and you just follow orders and check boxes all day and collect a paycheck, you're not elite. Now, in our society, we have elites who routinely use their money to hire lobbyists, to get influence, to get laws passed that favor the industries that they're in, to favor their business model and so forth, right? Those are the elites. Those are the people endorsing Robin DiAngelo, telling us that whites are so fragile that we can't even talk about how racist we are. And if we do, we fall apart, we get defensive. That just proves that we're racist and that we're fragile and that we shouldn't be in charge of anything. Unless you're anti-racist like she is, and then you get to be in charge of telling businesses how to run their businesses, and you get a lot of money, you know, for these giving these speeches and conducting these workshops. Your book becomes a bestseller. You know, if you're white and you do those things, then you're all right. You know, Robin DiAngelo is also, you know, doing pretty well for herself. You might even say if she's not elite herself, she's endorsed by the elites so strongly that she's elite adjacent, we could say. Right? So, who benefits? You know, if we have Ibram X. Kendi's vision of discrimination now, discrimination forever. If the idea is the only remedy for the past discrimination is discriminating right now on the basis of race. And the only way to remedy the discrimination now on the basis of race that we have to do to remedy the discrimination in the past on the basis of race, the only way to remedy that present discrimination is to just keep discriminating on the basis of race until the end of time. Future discrimination. Who benefits from that? The regular working people or the elites? Well, the elites are the ones endorsing him and his ideas, you know? I mean, who is most likely to have a hashtag BLM pro-BLM statement in their bio on social media. Somebody with a degree from Harvard or Yale, on the one hand, the Ivy League graduates, or, I don't know, somebody from Mississippi State or some community college in some small town in Kansas. You know, who's more likely to have that pro-BLM sign in their yard? Some guy living in a trailer park in West Virginia, or somebody living in a rich neighborhood, you know, where everybody has trust funds and everybody had their college paid for by mommy or daddy or grandma and grandpa's money, you know, where nobody had to bother to take out a student loan or work their way through school. No, it was all paid for. And they went to the best of private schools, and they got that diagnosis from a psychiatrist about their alleged learning disability. So they got extra time to take the SAT and ACT. Oh yeah, that exists. And they got, you know, private tutors to get them ready for the ACT and SAT. People like that, white people like that, sound pretty privileged. And interestingly enough, those are the white people who endorse Black Lives Matter Incorporated and Ibram X marks the spot Kendi. Almost like Ibram Kendi and Black Lives Matter Incorporated don't threaten their privileges at all. Almost like they have a common enemy. Almost like they see Black Lives Matter and Ibram X's and O's Kendi as being useful to them. It's very interesting, you know? So anyway, there's two possibilities here. One is that the elites know what they're doing and that they're picking the horse that they think is stronger and that's going to benefit them in the long run. And they're looking at things and they're like, we can use a guy like Ibram Kendi. Kind of like the way that the United States, you know, used the Mujahideen, the radical Islamists, you know, in Afghanistan to train them up and send them to fight the Soviets, right? Not because we necessarily are a radical Islamist society, but hey, these guys are useful to us, right? We're fighting the Cold War. They're in Afghanistan. Let's side with and arm the Islamic extremists. And of course, it turns out that came back to haunt us with 9/11. You know, of course, we still haven't learned our lesson because we keep using the radical Islamists in some of these cultures to engage in color revolutions and overthrow regimes that aren't friendly enough to U.S. business interests, that aren't friendly enough to the Wall Street globalists, you know, like Saddam Hussein. Interestingly, he was not liked by the radical Islamists. He was a very secular dictator, a strong man, but he, you know, as long as you stayed out of politics. I'm not saying Saddam was a great guy, but if you were a Chaldean Christian, you were sad to see Saddam go, because the people that we helped topple Saddam and then take power in his stead, not so friendly to Chaldean Christians, for example, you know, not so friendly to Jews, not so friendly, you know, but Saddam, he was a little too ornery, wasn't cooperative. So our business interests, well, they weren't being served by him. Whose business interests? The mom and pop stores or the big Wall Street banks? I don't know, you know? Yeah, we did the same thing with Syria, with Libya, with Egypt, you know, supporting the radical Islamist jihadist to oppose leaders, you know, and undermine leaders and overthrow leaders who were maybe brutal, certainly no more brutal than the radical Islamist jihadists, but yeah, they were brutal, you know, but they weren't really aligned with the Western globalists' interests, you know, the bankers and the big corporate interests. I don't know. You know, it seems like maybe there's something like that going on here with Black Lives Matter Incorporated and Antifa. Almost like the globalists, the elite, the bankers are like, yeah, this works for us. Just like supporting Islamist jihadists in Egypt seemed like a good idea back in, you know, 2009. just like supporting Islamist jihadists in Iraq back in 2003, 2004 seemed like a good idea. Just like supporting Islamist jihadists in Afghanistan back in 1979 seemed like a good idea. You know, maybe they see it the same way here. Maybe they see like, hey, if we can destabilize some of these local power structures, you know, so we can topple some of the self-governing or self-directing, you know, organizations or power structures that aren't fully aligned with our agenda, that could be a good thing for us and our profits and our banks and our, you know, whatever, right? There's that possibility. Which personally, I think that's highly likely. I don't think the elites are necessarily smart enough or competent enough to come up with a grand conspiracy and then from start to finish work everything out according to plan. I think they're opportunists, and I think they look at the situation and see, we can use this to our advantage. Let's promote this side. Let's fight against this other side, you know. I mean, the other possibility, and they're not mutually exclusive, is that it's a religion, which like John McWhorter, you know, in his recent book about woke racism, you know, kind of likens it to a religious ideology. And it really is. I mean, it's like you look at somebody like Ibram Kendi, and this guy's a religious fundamentalist. You know, he wants to reduce everything to the single dimension of race. This is his gospel. If we follow him and his ideas, then everything will be great. All the problems will be solved because every problem, you know, derives from race. And so he's the one who can help us overcome that. It's a religious position, because if you look at what he says, doesn't seem to be any set of occurrences, any evidence that would budge him out of his position. You know, an example of Ibram Kendi making an own goal when he tweeted about how white students applying for college are pretending to be people of color. And he did that, you know, because he hates white people. And so it's like, hey, this is a great thing to just show how evil white people are. Look at them again, you know, lying and cheating and stealing to try to hold on to their position, right? But inadvertently, what he's doing is suggesting that being white must not be all that much of a privilege if you're trying to pretend to be something other than white in order to get into the elite colleges, right? Like Elizabeth Warren, you know, is like 0.00001% Native American, right? I mean, most people have a higher percentage of Neanderthal DNA than Elizabeth Warren has Native American DNA, right? So, but she used that to get a teaching job at Harvard as a diversity hire, Harvard Law School, right? So Ibram Kendi tweeting that out, which he then promptly deleted, but too late before people screenshotted it and started sharing it and asking him about it. You know, it's like he's acknowledging inadvertently, that wasn't his intention. He was more like, look at these evil white people just lying and cheating and stealing. And it's like, well, why do the white people feel like they have to lie, cheat, and steal by saying that they're not white in order to get into these elite colleges? It must be that being white is a disadvantage relative to being, say, black or, you know, Hispanic. Right? And so Ibram Kendi acknowledged that. But even when that's pointed out, it's not, you never hear somebody like Ibram Kendi go, you know what? Now that I think about it, there's some truth in what you're saying. I'll acknowledge that. Yeah, maybe this is an issue. You know, maybe we need to look at this so that we're not unfairly disadvantaging people. Maybe we need to update our messaging about race and privilege to reflect the fact that in today's America, regardless of what was true in 1963, in today's America, that if you're applying to get into Harvard, it is an advantage to be able to say that you're black over being able to say that you're white. It's an advantage to be able to say you're black. Okay, so there's a privilege there. And rather than acknowledging that and saying, okay, let's acknowledge some nuance, some ambiguity, you know, no, he doubles down. He just deletes the tweet. Oh, these evil white people. Now, here's the thing. There's some, and this kind of comes back to the religious side. And for this, I'm going to So there's this book by Eric Hoffer called The True Believer, in which he talks about the psychology of mass movements. I'm going to put a link in the show note. So I mentioned the reading list that I have. It's link Amazon affiliate link, so you can get it from there, and they'll kick a few bucks back my way, or at no cost to you. Or if you don't want to support Jeff Bezos and the evil empire, see if you can find it at Barnes and Noble. But anyway, this book is really fascinating. It was written in the 50s, and it was written kind of in the aftermath of World War II, fascism, and communism that had swept the world, and kind of said, like, well, what is it that causes these mass movements? What? And really here, the thing that he talks about is less about the content of what they believe than kind of the psychology of the people who believe it, the real adherents, right? They're looking for an identity. They're looking for, hope in being rid of an identity that is loathsome to them, and instead forming this new identity based on this hopeful future and their membership in the right side of history, so to speak. It's a great book. And it explains a lot when you're looking at mass movements, and you could call Black Lives Matter Incorporated, the anti-racist stuff of Ibram Kendi. Basically, it's a mass movement, and it follows the same type of psychology that does. And, here's a quote from The True Believer, the chapter about the sinners. He says, "The technique of a mass movement aims to infect people with a malady and then offer the movement as a cure. An effective mass movement cultivates the idea of sin. It depicts the autonomous self not only as a barren and helpless, but also as vile. To confess and repent is to slough off one's individual distinctness and separateness, and salvation is found by losing oneself in the holy oneness of the congregation." And that also explains a lot about why Black Lives Matter is so effective, or at gathering followers, at seizing momentum, at capitalizing on these type of discontents that exist, because there is some truth to it. Because the thing is, and this is one of the things that I see, is like, this is a crisis of the story. People we like to think that we're real rational beings, that we are convinced by evidence and arguments and logic, like syllogisms can draw you towards truth, right? That's how we think. But most of the time, people kind of respond to a story that tells them how to understand themselves and the world around them. It makes sense of things, right? And so the story that traditionally has been told of American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, that kind of thing, yeah, that was a flawed story. It overlooked a lot of harm that the United States had done, and that American institutions had caused, and that racism and discrimination had caused. The idea that the founding fathers, these divinely inspired people who, where there's this story of America almost like it's a religious story, and our institutions and leaders were on the side of good all throughout history. Whether you're talking about the Spanish American War or World War I or the Korean War, whatever, like, we're always on the right side. It kind of ignores, it's more nuanced than that. It's an imperfect story. And if you really critically examine it, it's easy to poke holes in it, as far as being historically inaccurate, not acknowledging the role of racism and discrimination in shaping, America. Okay. But you don't improve things by replacing one flawed story with another flawed story. And that's what this anti-racist story is. It's a story, America, stand from the beginning, according to Ibram Kendi, or the 1619 Project. America is based on its real founding, came with the importation of African slaves. And that's what America's been all about, white supremacy from the beginning. That's not true either. And by not true, I'm just going to say, if you tell half the truth, it's a lie. If you kind of you could say, for example, hands up, don't shoot about Michael Brown, right? Maybe he had his hands up at some point, but not when he was shot, If he had his hands up, it was because he was wrestling with the police officer in the police officer's car for the police officer's gun. The guy, the Michael Brown's friend who from whom that whole hands up, don't shoot bit of fiction came from, thoroughly discredited in court and elsewhere. Total liar, right? But yet, that's what some people took away from it. Hands up, don't shoot, right? Well, maybe it was half true. Maybe he at some point did have his hands up initially, or maybe his hands up were because he was wrestling with the officer's gun. But when you hear hands up, don't shoot, and you're equivocating in that way, well, it's not really a lie because he did have his hands up when he was reaching for the officer's gun. He didn't have his hands down when he was reaching for the officer's gun. Well, you're encouraging people to form a impression of the situation. Hands up, don't shoot. Hands up must mean he's surrendering. He's being peaceful. He's not fighting back. No. Right? But you create that impression and then you don't bother to correct it. That's a lie. That's the essence of like propaganda manipulation, right? Is you take the truth, a little bit of it, and you kind of spin it in a way, kind of like, I don't know, Bill Clinton, where he's saying about the 92 presidential campaign when back then it was controversial for a politician to smoke weed, right? So he supposedly smoked weed when he was in college. Who cares? But his response was, well, I didn't inhale. Right? Well, that sounds like, oh, he didn't breathe in the smoke. No, that's not what that means. If you know about smoking cigarettes or marijuana or whatever, right? When you inhale, it means you take a drag from the joint, the cigarette, whatever. You remove the cigarette or joint from your lips, and then you breathe in some more so that smoke goes deeply into your lungs, right? Rather than just puffing it, you're inhaling it more. So it's kind of true, but the impression maybe, which I don't think I'm sure Bill Clinton inhaled. I don't think he was that stupid to like waste good pot by just puffing on it and not inhaling. But the point is, you trade on this ambiguity with a term. You use the term inhale, hoping that people are going to assume that you mean one thing by it when you really mean another. And then if they ever pointed out that this is wrong, you can always say, oh, well, that's not what I meant, because technically this word, kind of like the way Fauci with Rand Paul, when Rand Paul is grilling him about, did you support gain-of-function research? And he's like, well, no, he gives this convoluted justification later as to why he said he did not, when in fact he did. Well, gain of function, as we define this and that, it's a good way to weasel out of things. And then you can say, well, I didn't lie because technically gain of function means this. Even though you know what the person means when they're asking you the question, and even though you know that how people will hear what you're saying and the impression that they will form, you deliberately use this choice of words because it is misleading, because it confuses people, right? As people do that nowadays with racism. They intend racism to carry the same emotional weight as the old use of the term. Like when you say somebody's a racist, you're talking about this person believes that black people should have fewer rights than white people and they should be kept down. They shouldn't be given positions of responsibility or influence because they're black and not some other race. That's racist, right? And so people have a visceral reaction to that based on that old definition and based on the images of, say, like Bull Connor, in Birmingham, having the police sick their dogs on the child protesters, or the firemen turn the hoses on full blast against the children, marching peacefully, in defiance of, the segregation laws at the time, right? Like you have that image of racism. But then when the person calling a person racist today, they expect it to have that same emotional impact, but they're not using it in that way. So they'll call something racist when, say, for example, the guy David Shore, political activist, strategist or whatever, during the George Floyd riots had tweeted a link to a study by a black academic saying that that riots and violent protests led to diminished turnout for Democrats in elections, whereas nonviolent protests led to increased turnout for Democrats. And you had people say, that's racist, that's anti-black, this person should be canceled. The person did lose their job over it, even though he's on the same side, right? Because he said something that's not appropriately woke enough. It's it's questioning the narrative, right? So he's racist. So they use that term, the terminology racist, intending to convey that same emotional impact. You should hear that and say, oh, what? This person is like George Wallace. This person is like, this KKK member. They're wanting to lynch people. Like, you're supposed to put them in that same category. But then if you start to question for specifics, well, how was it racist? What do you mean by racist? Then they start equivocating. Well, this is, we mean by racist that you support a system in which there's, unequal outcomes, that one race of people has different outcomes than another. And that's what we mean. And, they equivocate. It's gaslighting. They're like, you call somebody racist, intending for it to carry that old weight of the old meaning of racism. And then when somebody questions you on it, you backpedal. You say, well, of course that's not what I'm saying. I'm not lying. You're imagining things. Why are you so defensive? And maybe you hear one of my cats in the background wanting to get out of the room, and so let her out. Anyway. But yeah, it's what I would liken that to is if you have somebody who calls somebody a pedophile today, right? And not in the sense of like they're Jeffrey Epstein or maybe Bill Clinton or Bill Gates on board the Lolita Express or Prince Andrew or whatever. But no, somebody, like say I was to say without any evidence whatsoever, Joe Biden is a pedophile, right? And intending it to have the full emotional weight of Joe Biden has sex with children, right? Or Joe Biden is sexually attracted to children and acts on it and he molests children, right? If I was to say Joe Biden's a pedophile, intending it to have that emotional impact, and then as soon as somebody says, well, what evidence do you have that Joe Biden is sexually attracted to children or that he acts on those sexual impulses or whatever, that he molests children? What evidence do you have of that? And I say, well, what I mean is, by pedophile, I mean that a pedophile is somebody who supports a system in which children are sexualized. And in America's system, given the way advertising, it presents these images of teenagers, sometimes who, as in this sexual, provocative, images or on social media or whatever. If you support our system and our system leads to those kind of sexualizing images of children, then you support a pedophilic system. And so therefore you're a pedophile. Right. Well, then all of a sudden I've changed the definition completely. I'm no longer talking about the same thing. And if I try to trade on that ambiguity that I've created by redefining the term to use to attack people and smear people and have that charge carry the same emotional weight, that's dishonest. And that's exactly what the people are doing who call everything racist. Critical race theory is to like make everything racist so that you can use it to control people and say, well, we got the answer. This is the remedy. This is the illness that's afflicting the whole of society, and we're the ones with the cure, the anti-racist agenda. Just hire us to do these, training seminars and all that. So there's a religious component to all that, anyways. What I'm saying, like that, you're not looking at people following, say, the scientific method, where they're saying, all right, well, our hypothesis is that that white people are more privileged than black people. So we're going to design a set of studies to test this hypothesis. We're going to have, for example, people with identical, qualifications submit an application to Harvard, identical test scores and everything. One's going to be black, one's going to be white. And we're going to see whose applications are accepted more frequently, right? They don't do that. And then they don't take the results and say, okay, that confirms my hypothesis or disconfirms my hypothesis. So I need to go back and kind of revisit, because that's what the scientific method would be. It was like you have this theory to explain the data, and then you propose a hypothesis like, okay, if this is true, then it would follow that this should occur. And so I'm going to test to see if this occurs. And if it doesn't, then, well, I'm on the wrong track and I need to go back and revisit my hypothesis. You don't see any of that among the anti-racist crowd. Instead, what you see is the religious type thinking where there's no way to falsify it. Hey, denial is the heartbeat of racism, right? So if you deny you're racist, you're racist. But if you admit you're racist, you're racist. So either way, you're racist, right? Or Robin DiAngelo, white fragility, right? If you get defensive when somebody talks to you about your racial bias and how, prejudiced you are as a white person, if you get defensive at all and say, well, I don't know that I'm so prejudiced. Like, I don't have a problem with people of different races. I have friends and family members, of different races, and I treat them the same as I treat anybody that's the same race as me. If you say that, that shows that you're fragile and therefore you're racist. Why are you so defensive? You must be hiding something. It's actually because you're racist, but then if you admit you're racist, if you just say, okay, you got me. Let me do your program so that I can learn how I'm racist and how I can correct for it. There you go. You're racist. So either way, you're racist. No way to falsify it. Right. So there's the religious component there. I guess they both can be true, is what I'm saying. Is like you could have a religious movement that attracts people because it gives them an identity. It gives them some hope for a future. They can be on the right side of history. But you can also have where the elite, similar to the way they use Islamic jihadists and fomenting color revolutions in Libya and Egypt and Iraq and wherever else, you can have the same thing where you have elites today looking at the situation and saying, we can use this religious movement spearheaded by your Ibram X Factor Kendis and Robin DiAngelo's and Black Lives Matter Incorporated. We can use this. This is useful to us. So let's support that, endorse that, make people read these books, make people do these programs, follow these policies and all that. And if you criticize or question it, you're the enemy, right? So they have a common enemy. They're like, yeah, we don't like having, white, working class white people, those broke ass white people living in trailer parks in Appalachia, too independent minded. They're living in these rural, remote areas that are hard to control. They resist things like lockdowns and shutdowns and mandates and all that. They're agitated. They're well armed. They have this independent streak. That's who we don't like if we're a globalist. If we're and then similarly, if you have black people who are, whether it's Candace Owens or Larry Elder or even more moderate, black people like, Thomas Chatterton Williams or Glenn Lowry or, people like that. Once again, right? If you're looking at them as like they're kind of against our agenda, so we're going to oppose them. They're going to be the black face of white supremacy. They're going to be the ones getting censored or whatever, right? But if it's Ibram Kendi promoting this idea of racial grievances to the end of time, racial discrimination, that actually works quite well in our favor as globalists, promoting the interests of big businesses, big corporations, big banks, the military industrial complex, the intelligence services, all this, right? Yeah, you can say it's a conspiracy theory, but that's one of those overused objections, right? Because what does that tell you? Okay, there's a theory that there's a conspiracy. It doesn't tell you whether it's right or wrong. All I'm saying is, this is what I see, and it's worth asking the question. If these people on the anti-racist side are really speaking truth to power, if they have correctly diagnosed the problem that America is racist top to bottom and that whites are just fighting tooth and nail to hang on to white supremacy and will do anything to keep black people down, then why are the elite whites who have the most power, the most influence, the most privilege, why are they the ones endorsing Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, and that whole thing, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Joy Reid? Why are they the ones getting that endorsement? I'm just proposing, that they are the useful idiots of the elites as a way to make sense of this phenomena that makes better sense of it than the theory that America really is so deeply racist and Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones are the ones that we need to enforce their vision of what a racial utopia is going to look like. A racial utopia in which there's all these laws and regulations and administrative bodies created to enforce this regime where you're going to aim for racial equity, and you're going to have a Department of Anti-Racism that's going to pre-clear all laws and policies enacted on the state, local, or federal level, and that's going to manage the affairs of private businesses and make sure they're in compliance. That sounds like the kind of thing that's going to benefit your big corporations, your big banks, your elites, And so you just got to ask yourself. Anyway, why do the elites want a race war? Because that's what they're promoting. Because at the end of the day, do you really think that your millions of working poor, struggling white people who suffered under these lockdowns and mandates for a virus that if you're not over 60 and you don't have comorbidities is no more lethal than the seasonal flu. But we've shut down businesses and confined people to their homes, got people used to, following mandates based on an ever-changing messaging from public health officials, right? Like, you get this demographic of white people who are struggling, who's just like all working class people have, the rich have gotten richer, the working people have not kept pace. Wages, earnings, have not kept pace. I mean, yeah, wages are up now, but so is inflation. So is costs. You would know this if you are a regular working stiff, going to, say, Walmart to buy, stuff to make bologna sandwiches, right? You'll notice bread and bologna is 50%, no exaggeration, more expensive today than it was last year, right? So people aren't doing well. People are struggling. And then you've got this growing sense of frustration that people have, that they've been lied to, they've been swindled, that they have people that are in power who don't give a fuck about them, who are just trying to, look out for themselves, who sell us on this globalization strategy, like during the Clinton administration, NAFTA and these other trade agreements that hollow out the working class, but reap great gains for the multimillionaire and billionaire class, right? Like, you have people that are really frustrated, white working class people, really frustrated by all that. And this is the answer. You're pushing on them. You're bad. You're racist. You're the problem. You need to shut up. You need to bow down and kiss the feet of these BLM protesters burning down your business because you don't know how racist you are. And you need to shut your business down, and you need to come work for us, where we'll give you the workshops and the mandatory training every year about sensitivity and about diversity and inclusion and equity, DIE, as Gad Sad rephrased it, die. That, and that that's not going to go well. That if you're talking to somebody who's lost their job, they were a coal miner in West Virginia, and the mines shut down because this Build Back Better Green New Deal stuff, and they're struggling to put food on the table. Inflation is through the roof, right? And your answer is, you guys need to give up some of your privilege. You guys are the problem. Pointing at you as being, all right, poor racial minorities, this is the enemy. Direct your anger at him, at Bubba, living in a single wide trailer. That's not going to go well. That's just going to create division and chaos, and it's going to undermine the stability of local communities, local institutions. And what's that going to mean? A power vacuum that's going to be great for global and national businesses and banks and, institutions to just come in and take over. And that's really, what I think the best way to understand why the elites want a race war. And if you think I'm wrong, then you come up with a better explanation as to why the elites who have the power and the money and the privilege are promoting your anti-racist gospel of, Ibram ex-Marxist Spot Kendi or Robin DiAngelo. Why the people in power are promoting this. If I come to you and I say, this society is so corrupt from top to bottom, it's based on these evils, and I'm gonna fix it. You support me, and I'm gonna tear all the institutions down, and I'm gonna recreate them in a way that's gonna be better for everybody. And you notice that my critics come from the working class primarily, and my supporters come from the upper class elites primarily. That should cause you to wonder, what is this guy really about? Like when you hear about Patrisse Cullors, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, buying multi-million-dollar real estate in all these elite neighborhoods next door to the very people who are running the institutions that she claims are so corrupt and racist, makes you wonder, does she really believe what she's saying? Is she really trying to make the world better for poor people or for very rich people? And this is a way for her to join the very rich people, and they can all make the world better for them together. I think you guys know what the answer is, you know? So what is the answer? I think the answer is a better national story, for one. A better story in which, and I'm gonna talk about a better national story, a better cultural story in a later episode of this season of the podcast, in which I'm asking these questions. What's really going on in our society today? And this one, why do the elites want a race war? Well, I told you why. And the way to fight that back is to tell a better story. To tell a better story about the way in which the elites have used these divisions, have divided and conquered working people, you know? And you can tell, that's the story of how racism came to be endemic in America in the 1800s, you know, is 1800s, is that you had slave owners, right? What's a good way to, if you have these cotton plantations, what's a good way for you to increase your profits? Is to drive down your labor costs. Well, what better way to drive down your labor costs than to have free labor? Have slaves, right? Because then you don't have to hire people to do it, and that's going to depress the wages of the working poor, right? Like if you can get people to, if you can own people so that they have to work for you for free, then hey, you can drive down wages. Well, some people are earning $0, so factor that in. That's going to drive down your wages, right? So that's going to be a big benefit to the people at the very top of society. You know, the small percentage of white people in the South who actually owned slaves and owned the plantations, and it's going to be a real detriment to the working poor whites. And of course, if you sell it to them right, which they apparently did, then you get the working poor buying into this doctrine that ensures their own degradation and continued, you know, bad outcomes, right? You tell these black people, you tell these broke ass white people, oh, you know, these black people are agitating for more freedom. They want to be just like you. You want to maintain your little tiny slice of privilege over them. So you promote this division so that they don't come together and recognize that, hey, we got a common enemy here. We're all struggling. You guys are struggling worse than we are, but we're struggling too. And these people at the very top, they're the ones breaking it all in, right? They're the ones, I mean, during the Civil War, right? The South, you could get exempted from service based on the number of slaves your family owned. Boy, isn't that nice? A war to protect the institution of slavery in the South, and the people that own the slaves and benefit from that institution don't even have to fight in it. But the people who don't own slaves, they're the ones going off to lose their lives. How do you accomplish that? How do you accomplish a regime where you're fucking people over from the working class and managing to get them fighting each other so that they're both doing your dirty work to keep themselves down and you in power? Divide and conquer. Classic strategy. It's the way we work when we foment these color revolutions abroad, you know, to promote the interests of American business and multinational corporations and banks at the expense of local populations. You know, there's a handful of elites in these countries that, hey, you work with us. I mean, just watch the movie or read the book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Hey, I'm going to put a link to that book in the show notes as well, an affiliate link. So again, if you want to check out any of these books, click on the links. You know, Amazon will kick a few bucks back my way, or if you don't want to support the evil empire of Jeff Bezos, go to Barnes & Noble or a, you know, used bookstore in town. But yeah, that's how we do it. You take a corrupt family, kind of like the way the Bidens are corrupt, you know, with like Ukraine, right? Ukraine is this corrupt country. You know, while Biden's vice president, you put pressure on on corrupt politicians in Ukraine, you know, don't investigate this company that my son, who has no qualifications, is on the board of and, you know, deriving a pretty nice amount of income from. Don't stop that investigation. If you do, you get aid from us. And he doesn't get called on it. But then Trump, you know, and if you've listened to this podcast, you know I was not on the side of Trump. I'll talk about Trump in a future episode, about my recovery from Trump derangement syndrome, and how at this point I just suspend judgment about Trump, whether he's good or bad. I don't know, because most of what I thought I knew about him came from the mainstream media, who I've realized you can't trust. They lie to you. They have an agenda. They're not on your side, right? So it is interesting to notice the difference in coverage of Biden's dealings in Ukraine and Trump's dealings in Ukraine. And the fact that like news stories, legitimate news stories about Hunter Biden's laptop and documents that may show that there's some corruption going on there were censored in the mainstream media and on social media by big tech, right? Anyway, sorry for going off on the tangent, but you get the idea, right? That there's this idea that you have an elite class and they go to these foreign countries like the Bidens with Ukraine and they tell people, hey, you work with us, you and your family will do quite well for yourselves. Now, it's going to fuck over your country as a whole. You know, the people that live in your country are going to largely suffer as a result. But you and your family and your fellow elites will do well. Elites win on both sides of the exchange, right? Ordinary working people, they lose in America and in Ukraine, but the elites win, right? And looking at the dynamics in America with the Black Lives Matter Incorporated and Ibram X. Marxist Spot Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, hey, we got the same thing going on. The elites using an insurgency to foment a color revolution right here in the United States. They're running psyops on us. And Black Lives Matter Incorporated is the useful idiots that they're using to do it. And that's why there's no surprise that Black Lives Matter co-founders are multimillionaires and moving among the global elite now. Because they took that devil's bargain. They took that same bargain that the corrupt politicians in Ukraine took to say, yeah, we'll work with you, elite class in America. We'll work with you. Thank you for enriching us. Yeah, we're gonna fuck over the regular people that we claim to represent, but we'll work with you. So benefit us, we'll benefit you. We'll do this together. And so many people willing to just blindly ignore the obvious question of follow the money. Who's benefiting? Who's getting rich off this? Who's improving their own situation and who's being hurt? So anyway, all this to say, why do the elites want a race war in the United States? And why should you as an ordinary working person not want a race war? It's because it helps the elites. And one of the last things that I want to say is thank God for diversity of opinion in minority communities. Black people and people of other racial and ethnic minorities who see through the bullshit and are coming out against it. Your Candace Owens. And I'm not saying this to say that I agree with everything Candace Owens says, but I'm glad that there are people like her, people like Thomas Sowell, people like Clarence Thomas, or people like, on a more moderate level, your Glenn Lowry's and John McWhorter's, right? It's good to have people like that because there's a growing amount of rage among working poor whites. And the real danger is that when they lash out in anger against the elite doctrines that have caused them harm, that they lash out against the accomplices of the elites, and they identify this race or this ethnicity with being allies of the elites and lash out against them and make it a racial or ethnic conflict. And that's absolutely a losing game. That's terrible. That would be the worst case scenario for the United States, for everybody. Because I can tell you, and I'm a military veteran, served in Iraq, so I'm not saying that I'm Billy Badass or anything like that. I'm not. But I just, having seen a culture where there is that level of ethnic strife and violence, it ain't pretty, And so some of these people, and this is no shit, during the George Floyd riots, you'd see this on social media, people on the side of Black Lives Matter Incorporated, unashamedly, unabashedly calling for basically a race war, calling for violence against whites. I mean, you see that with that Waukesha parade where that guy who was career criminal out on bail after trying to run somebody over with his car, he goes to this parade targeting white people. That's the only people that he hits. Young, old, male, female. The one common denominator, he targeted white people. And on his social media, all this stuff pro Black Lives Matter, anti-white, right? Of course, the media runs cover for him. The police are baffled. Well, we don't know what his motives were. Could have been. No, we're not going to treat it like a hate crime. This is just some random isolated incident. Nothing to see here, America. Now you can believe if it had been the other way around, if a white guy who had, all this stuff about the Aryan Nation on his social media. Of course, he would have got kicked off of social media. But if he had all this stuff about the Aryan Nation on social media, calling for violence against blacks, and then he went out and deliberately drove over as many black people as he could in a parade. Oh, yeah, that would have been on cover to, coast to coast, front page news, headline news, whatever. Would have been nonstop social media, all the outrage. There would have been riots and protests about white violence and white rage and all that sort of stuff, right? But, black person does it. And the elites, and again, it's one of those things. You sow this division helps them. This level of hatred between groups fighting each other and undermining each other helps them, right? And so when they do this, the temptation, if you're a working class white person, is you see the forces that the powers that be in society are allied against you and allied with this sort of racist movement among black people, to target you as the enemy, right? The natural reaction is to, just on a gut, visceral, emotional level, to lash out against those people you see advancing that agenda. Oh, these black people want to side with the elites against me? All right, they're my enemy. No, that's the wrong way to do it. Do not take the poison bait. Don't bite the poison apple. It is death for everybody if you do that. You cannot identify people based on race and say they're the enemy. That is the worst thing that just leads to this cycle of violence that once it gets really started, and look at Syria, look at Iraq for evidence of this. Once it gets started, it is hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And man, it's ugly and everybody loses, But that's what the elites are kind of promoting because, of course, when shit goes down, right, they're not the ones whose businesses are being burned in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Or if they are, if you're somebody who's like you manage a hedge fund and you've got stock in Target, right? One Target gets burned down and looted. It's not that big a deal because all the mom and pop stores got burned down and looted too. And you're going to be able to rebuild. They're not. You're going to be able to, and hey, you got this hedge fund. Chances are you also got stock in Amazon and Walmart and Target, and people just start shopping online, right? So you benefit. You're okay. But the people whose communities just got burned, whose businesses just got burned, they're not okay, right? So remember who benefits here. But back to the whole thing about racial animosity. And this is a key critical takeaway that, by anything you hold sacred, God, who I believe is good ultimately, for the love of God, do not go down that road. Do not go down the road of championing. Even if you're black and you think, oh, this is a good thing because we've been done so wrong by America. And I could understand, like, if you grew up black, especially if you grew up in the 50s, 60s, even 70s, or 80s, I can understand, depending on what your life experiences have been, if you faced discrimination and racism, why you would be angry about it and think, okay, yeah, this makes sense. White people are the enemy. This whole thing is white supremacist. I'm not getting a fair shake. I'm asking you, don't go that route. Look at, you got more in common with working poor whites than you do with the elites. And the elites are the ones promoting this agenda that you're signing on to. Don't do it. They are not on your side. They are trying to use you to attack somebody that they view as their enemy. And as soon as they're done with you, they're done with you. As soon as you turn against them, as soon as you start questioning their narrative, as soon as you start saying, well, I don't know about what the elites are saying about this. Like, I have to get the vaccine. I don't know about that. As soon as that happens, guess what they do? They come out against you. You're now the enemy, you know? And so, you know, that cycle of racial violence, that's the thing that I fear, but I'm hopeful when I see people of different races, you know, coming together against this, that people won't buy into that. You know, there will be some people that do. It's kind of inevitable. You're going to have your people out there, whether they call themselves racial realists or just come right out and say they're white supremacists, who will tell you, well, they try to say that we're all equal, but look at the crime rates, look at the education rates, look at the problem is black people, and therefore we need, no, don't fucking go down that route. Because as soon as you start saying, oh yeah, I can identify my enemy based on their skin color, I can identify no. Because as soon as you do that, what happens, right? You're going to have, just like with Iraq, just like with Lebanon during their civil war, you're going to have one group go out, and they're going to blow up, you know, a wedding or a church ceremony for this group, right? You're going to have a white guy go into a black church and just shoot a bunch of people, which we've had happen. And then you're going to have black people say, fuck that, we're going to take these white people out, and then you're going to have black people going to a white, you know, church and blowing it up or whatever. That's what happens. And then once that gets going, even people who don't think of themselves as racist and don't want to be racist, for simple self-preservation, they're going to side with their side because they don't want to get blown up and killed. So they're like, hey, I'm not safe if I go into a black neighborhood because they're just, you know, I might be the target of this racial violence that's taking off and escalating, right? It just feeds itself. It's similar to the fact that if you go to prison today, if you're not racist, but you're white, you probably would join the Aryan Nation, because if you don't, you're going to be the bitch of some Crip or Blood or, you know, whatever. So you join up with your own side, even if that means that you're joining up with these racists so that you don't become the bitch of some Crip or Blood or whatever, right? It was the same thing if we allow the idea of racial grievance to take root and really buy into it. And that's what makes it so difficult when you have people, and I've encountered this on social media, folks who are openly black supremacists, you know, in the same way that they accuse, you know, people on the right of being white supremacists. They're openly black supremacists. You know, that you can go on Twitter, for example. People don't get banned for this. Folks like Tariq Nasheed, the total douchebag demagogue, you know, will have these theories that they'll openly promote about white people, you know, or basically genetically flawed, you know, and they'll have black supremacist ideas. You know, they'll openly condemn, say, for example, Patrick Mahomes. Oh, you know, he's a traitor to the race. You know, look at how they're, you know, this is what happens when you get with a snow bunny and you have white children. You know, you exterminate your African roots. They'll say things like that. And if you engage with them at all, their game is to try to get you to come back with, because they'll come at you with like, oh, look at, you know, white people have done all these bad things, black people have done all these great things. And the natural response to that is to want to say, well, wait a minute. Okay, yeah, white people have done some bad things, but white people have also done some great things. You know, so what about this? What about this? What about this? And what about these bad things that black people are doing? But as soon as you do that, you've adopted their framework, their way of and they've set the terms of the debate. Now it's your side versus my side. My side is this race, your side is that race. And that's terrible. You know, instead it's to say, no, we're not. This idea of a race is like a modern invention. It would derive from these sort of economic incentives that people had to create these concepts of race to justify slavery. And you can read, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about this. There's a book by Brian Fair called Notes of a Racial Caste Baby, in which he talks about this. I mean, the idea is that race is a modern invention of predatory capitalism. Cornel West is another one. And I'm not saying with these guys that everything they say is right or I agree with everything. I'm just saying that some of the things that they taught when they analyze history, there's some truth to what they say, you know, and there's a lot of truth to the idea that your modern concepts of race are this invention to justify a form of predatory capitalism, right? And so the best way to deal with that is to just say, no, these racial categories are bullshit. You know, the idea that somehow I should feel, and I look at this as like a parent with biracial black children, right? Like your Dr. Ibram X's and O's Kendi is telling me that I should feel a closer kinship with some random white person I've never met, whose interests may or may not align with my own. I should feel a closer kinship with some random white person than I should with my own children because of race. Like that I have this deep and meaningful bond with people that I've never met and don't have anything in common with just because we have a similar complexion. And that should trump, you know, the bond that I have with my own children because they're biracial. Like, give me a fucking break. I mean, the concepts of race, I mean, culture matters, and there are differences in culture, yes. And a lot of these cultural differences do align somewhat loosely with race. You know, you can say, yeah, you're more likely to eat collard greens with hot sauce in a black household than a white household, typically. But that's not to say there's not white people, especially in the South. I mean, because that's what collard greens with hot sauce is. It's a Southern dish, not necessarily a black dish. It's just black people in the Great Migration took Southern culture to some of these northern and West Coast cities with them, right? But yeah, I mean, you could say that's a cultural difference. What does it mean at the end of the day? I mean, I don't know. Whatever. If you like collard greens with hot sauce, you know, good for you. If you don't, whatever. I mean, it doesn't fucking matter, right? But I mean, those differences exist, but they shouldn't define who we are. They shouldn't define what lives we can expect for ourselves or our values or any of that. You know, it's just absurd. I mean, and the idea of this cultural appropriation, you know, now, yeah, there's some truth to that in the 1950s. If you have like black artists creating, you know, black musicians creating a new music form, writing songs, performing music, and they're not getting anywhere because of discrimination. And then you have, you know, producers finding a white guy to cover their songs and sound very similar to them, and he's the king of rock and roll. Yeah, that's one thing. And then the problem is not the cultural appropriation. It's not the fact that you have a white singer covering black music. It's that the black musicians are discriminated against actively and openly, and the white musicians are promoted, you know, purely on the basis of race. That's the problem there. The problem is not people borrowing from each other's cultures, because that's how cultures spread. That's just normal. You know, just look at the English language. Look at you look at the etymology of words, how many words we've gotten from French, from German, from Latin, from Italian, from Arabic, you know, from Spanish. You know, is it cultural appropriation to refer to, you know, a tornado as a tornado? Right? I mean, that's a Spanish word, right? Is it cultural appropriation? No, I mean, it's just organically how it happens. You know, there's nothing wrong with white people enjoying tacos on Taco Tuesday. That's not a fucking microaggression or cultural appropriation. You know? I mean, the problem would be is if it was like it was in the 1950s and you had, you know, because of discrimination and racism, like people not wanting to support any business owned by or operated by Mexicans, but then you had white people operating a business that basically just ripped off what the Mexican businessmen were doing, and white people supporting it just because, oh, these are white people, so we can support them. That would be a problem. But there's the racism. It's not the appropriation, or it's not the use of one person's culture by somebody from a different culture. That's what culture spread. So fuck all that bullshit about cultural appropriation, you know. And don't even entertain those arguments that tell you that you should, you know, those people, the black supremacists, and you can find these folks, they don't get kicked off of social media. They don't get censored by the mainstream media. Your Tariq Nasheeds and people like that who are just openly racist against white people. Don't buy into their arguments by engaging them on their terms. Don't let them set the terms of the debate. The proper response to them is not necessarily to ignore them, but to call them the racist pieces of shit that they are. You know, to call them out in the same way that you would call out a white supremacist, like a, not, you know, the Ibram Kendi version of white supremacy, but like a real white supremacist, somebody who really does believe that Jim Crow was a good thing and that, you know, black people are inferior and they need to be kept down and all that. in the same way you would respond to them by saying you're a demagogue, you're a piece of shit, that's not the way we're going to live, because these racial categories aren't even real biologically. They're not meaningful in the way that you think that they are, and so we should not use them to order our society. Sorry, my kids and one of their friends were really getting into an Xbox game in the background, so you may have heard them screaming. But anyway, yeah, so, and they're model diversity, right? Biracial black kids, and then they got a biracial Asian friend that's over. Woohoo! Of course, if Ibram Kendi has his way, they'll be all aggrieved at each other about your group's more privileged than my group. You're not my friend. You need to become anti-racist, or you're my enemy. Anyway, fuck Ibram Kendi is what I'm saying. The dude's a total douchebag piece of shit who's only in for his own fucking paycheck and his own power trip. I mean, fuck Ibram X marks the spot Kendi. Fuck Robin DiAngelo. Fuck Black Lives Matter Incorporated. Fuck Patrisse Cullors and her $1 million mansions all over the country. These guys are grifters, liars, con artists, pieces of shit. And they're tools of the elite. They're useful idiots of the elites, or being bribed by the elites, whatever. But whose side are they on? They're on the Wall Street Bank side. They're on the elites in the Democratic Party establishment and Republican Party establishment side. They're on the side of the big Fortune 500 corporations. They're on the side of the globalists, the people who want to bring you the Great Reset, who want to make sure that by 2030 you own nothing and have no privacy, but for whatever reason, life will never be better. And if you disagree with that, if you're not happy like they think you should be, don't worry. They'll make sure that you pay for it and that you never have a presence on social media or get to voice your opinion if you're in any way not totally happy to be eating bugs, owning nothing, living in a pod, having no privacy, whatever. Right, so, okay, long rambling story. Let me just bring this to a close by saying the way forward really is, I know this is kind of cliched to say, but it's true. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his I Have a Dream speech, it's really the way forward, is really to aim for a world in which, and I'm borrowing Sam Harris's analogy here, where we care less about how many black people or Asian people or, Native American people are admitted to Harvard each year. I mean, in the same way that we don't give a fuck how many blondes, how many brunettes, how many redheads go to Harvard. It doesn't matter, That should be the end game, where people, no matter what your race or ethnicity, you have a fair and equal opportunity to succeed in America, where race doesn't hold you back at all. Where, and to do that, we got to also acknowledge the other factors that do play a part in people's lives. Socioeconomic class, the education levels of your parents and the education levels of your peers, the opportunities that are open to you, the employment opportunities, the things like that, that are independent of race, because otherwise it's just absurd. You have somebody telling me that this broke guy coming from Appalachia, growing up in a trailer park, dad's an out of work coal miner, who dies of opioid addiction, so now he's being raised by a single mom who's like got 3 shitty jobs, that she works part-time, right? And nobody in the family has a college degree, and right, you're telling me that this person is privileged in a way that the Obama children, for example, or Jay-Z's children are not privileged? Right? Like Jay-Z and Beyonce's children, like they're not privileged, but the child growing up in a single wide trailer in Appalachia is privileged. It just doesn't even make sense. I mean, there's ways in which race is a factor, all other things being equal, and that should be addressed. That should be acknowledged and addressed. But to pretend that race is the only factor, or even the most important factor, when it's demonstrably not, to get up in arms every time the police shoot a black person, regardless of whether the black person was armed or unarmed, fighting back, trying to kill somebody, pointing a gun at the cops, whatever, shooting at the cops, Black Lives Matter Incorporated, it doesn't matter. That's all that matters. Police shot a black person, riot, protest. Defund the police. Abolish the police. you know, but then let a white person be on the receiving end of a bullet from the police. Doesn't matter. Whether a white person's unarmed, whether you're Tony Timpa with police officers, including black police officers, in on it, kneeling on you for 12 minutes instead of the 8 minutes that George Floyd. And I'm not saying that diminishes the horror of George Floyd's death. That regardless of George Floyd, maybe he was a piece of shit in his life, maybe he had done a lot of bad things, doesn't mean that the police should have been abusing their power and authority the way they did, which did result in him dying. Had the police not knelt on his back for that amount of time, high probability he would still be alive, right? So Tony Timpa's death, a white guy, similar circumstances, it doesn't diminish or change. It just shows that we have a problem maybe with police in some respect. And not to say that we need to abolish the police, but that we need to identify that, okay, the police fuck up. And when they fuck up, people should have a recourse. There should be consequences. We shouldn't just say, well, Blue Lives Matter, and that's the end of it. The guy probably should have been complying. No, I mean, some of these circumstances, the police are right. Some of these circumstances is an issue. The police probably didn't have the tools or the training, and maybe that's the thing. We need to train them better, give them better tools. It's a tough job if you're in a situation where you have an adrenaline dump because you're in, whether it's real or perceived, some physical danger to your safety, to your person, and you got to make split-second decisions about whether to escalate, the use of force, whether you use deadly force. That's a tough job, and you should not Monday, morning like armchair quarterback them when they get it wrong, as long as it's a legitimate mistake. That's a gray area. It's a whole can of worms, I know, but the idea that every single one of these police killings just shows the police are racist, no, that's not the case. I mean, because you can find police killings, video footage of them killing white people in the exact same circumstances. You can find images, videos of black police officers shooting unarmed white suspects. They're out there. They don't get the same attention, And so, again, the thing is to say race is not the only variable that we're going to hyper focus on that to the exclusion of other things like class, like poverty. I mean, hey, if you drive a piece of shit car in a nice neighborhood, you're going to attract attention from police. Doesn't matter if you're white or black. Now, maybe you attract slightly more attention if you're black. And if so, that's a problem. But to pretend that that's the only thing driving it, that a broke-ass white person driving a broke-ass piece of shit car in a ritzy neighborhood, to ignore that white person and say, well, it doesn't matter. You're privileged. You need to just shut up. We're not going to worry about it when it happens to you. That's a mistake. We need to, take a more holistic view of things. If there's needing to be police reform, it needs to be an honest conversation about it. And it needs to address realities on the ground, including the fact that, well, black people disproportionately live in higher crime neighborhoods. And so maybe there's going to be more contacts with the police. I mean, over 50% of homicides committed by black people. And that's from victim statements. That's not from arrest records. That's from victim statements describing the perpetrator. And most of these victims are black. Black people are also more likely to be victimized by a homicide. Right? So if we don't acknowledge that, that's going to be a big blind spot in whatever policy we come up with to fix the problem, right? So what we need is more truth, more honesty, more openness, more candor, something more like the scientific method where we say, all right, let's look at the evidence, let's come up with hypotheses to explain the evidence, and then let's test those hypotheses by making predictions and gathering evidence and seeing if it comes true. That's the way to move forward, not to have some religious movement like Black Lives Matter Incorporated, where it's all race. That's the only thing that you need to understand is America's racist, it hates black people, and if you're white, you get all this privilege. If you're black, you get it's open season on you. The police want to kill you. And once we, let Ibram Kendi create this fourth branch of the federal government that's going to have more power than all the other branches of the government combined, it's going to get to police and micromanage every private business and every local government across the country. That's the answer? No. That's a delusion. So anyway, all that to say, don't buy takeaways. All right. Don't don't even engage with black supremacist, racist fucks on their terms. Don't let them set the terms of the debate. No, race is a bullshit category. It has no biological basis. It's not meaningful. And so don't accept this thing like I got to defend everything white people have done, and I got to against you because you're arguing that black people are superior to white people based on what black people have done and white people have done. No, that's a bullshit debate. Don't even have it. Just call out those people for the piece of shit racists that they are. Tariq Nasheed, I'm looking at you, you fucking piece of shit. You sorry ass wannabe fucking failed rapper. You fucking demagogue. 0 IQ paint chip eating piece of shit. Fuck you, Tariq Nasheed, and fuck the horse you rode in on. Fuck you. That's what I feel about that. And anybody aligned with his ilk, anybody who's in that camp of like black supremacists, oh, they did it to us in the 1800s and 1950s, and so we're going to do it to them today, and that makes it right. 2 wrongs don't fucking make a right. And all you're doing is just perpetuating the same cycle of racial grievance, racial violence, racial discrimination, on and on and on and on and on. No, that's not the way forward for anybody, white or black. The way forward is to acknowledge racism as this bullshit category that's made up by a predatory capitalist to justify slavery, to justify discrimination in the past that benefited the elite class, and to recognize that the elites have not changed their tactics and they're doing the same shit today, trying to divide and conquer working people and keep us at each other's throat instead of recognizing the common enemy, right? That's the way forward. And so, yeah, have a conversation about reparations. Ta-Nehisi Coates has written about this, and NSA, he makes some good points. You can't just write it all off. Well, we're not racist today, so therefore, no. I mean, it's like if you have identifiable victims of racist policies like redlining, a partnership between the federal government and banks to discriminate against black people, to ruin certain neighborhoods, which they benefited from whenever they can cause neighborhoods to fail and cause white flight. Oh, that's a big boon for the banks, right? Because who gets to write all these mortgages, when the whites flee and build up a new community, right? Who gets to, it's a game where you divide and conquer. The elites win, And so anyway, bottom line is, let's make that right. Let's have a conversation about reparations where there's identifiable victims. By all means, we should do something to correct that. Even as a culture. I mean, I think this is like something that the concept, I'm going to just harken back to the Bible, not saying like, oh, it's in the Bible, therefore we have to do it in America, but just as an example, like there's this concept in particularly the Old Testament about some of the, like a crime or a wrong that might pollute a society, and therefore a society has an obligation to condemn, right? Like you have somebody who, and I'm not saying this to say that we this is what we should do here, but I'm just using this as an example of this. You have these capital offenses where it's like, and the way it's worded in the Old Testament, a lot of times it's like, that this is like a defilement to the community, and the community has to be cleansed by it. Like you remember the person who there was this battle where God's supposedly telling them like, don't, the whole thing needs to go when you take the city. Don't keep anything for yourself. And there's this one guy who's like, this looks like kind of nice. There's some of these riches. I'm going to keep them for myself secretly, even though I'm not supposed to. There's this big deal where then the Israelites go out, lose the next battle. And there's like this, no, you got to purify the community. You got to purify the camp. There's corruption, contamination in the camp. And so it's like they death penalty, and they burn the guy's belongings and everything like that, right? All right, so I'm not saying that's what we need to do in America, but what I am saying is that there's a similar type of corruption that took place in this culture with slavery, Jim Crow, racism, that does need a public acknowledgement that it's really wrong. And like, there's some truth to that. To that kind of idea that you have to say, okay, we're going to make this right. We're going to say, and I think that there's been some of that, there's been a lot done with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and all the many ways. Now, of course, that's been turned into something very different where now it protects trans rights. And you can't tell me that was the intent of the legislators in 1964 when they're voting on that, like, you know what, I think we should also include people who are biologically men, but they think they're women. We should also include them under these protections. Whatever. That's where you got courts that just expand it to where it's no longer recognizable. But this idea, though, that, you know, that you have to acknowledge as a society real wrong that was done and really acknowledge how we're going to try to make it right. And not to say that we haven't done that. Not to say that there's not been huge progress made since 1965. I mean, the fact that today we're worried about microaggressions, that ought to tell you we've made some real progress. You know, if now we're worried about, hey, if you're a white person, don't just compliment a black person, a black woman on her hair because that might make her uncomfortable. Because why are you noticing her hair but not other people's hair? Why are you making a big deal about her hairstyle? Like, the fact that we're worried about that and not about, like, don't lynch somebody because they whistled at a white woman, you know, that's some real progress. Because that's what we were worried about in 1955. This is what we're worried about in 2022. That's a huge step forward, right? So we need to acknowledge the progress we've made. We also need to look at where there's progress that still needs to be made. It's a nuanced conversation. You need to acknowledge, of course, though, that race as a biological category is bullshit, and that we need to get past it as soon as we possibly can as a species. But of course, acknowledge the harm done. Don't just pretend like it didn't happen. Yeah, we need to learn about our history, warts and all. Not through critical race theory, which is Marxist. And no, we don't need Marxists teaching us about our history. But we need to learn the history, warts and all, but also learn that we've made progress. We're making progress. There's hope for the future. And the way forward is really the vision that Martin Luther King set out in his I Have a Dream speech. That's the way forward. And the elites, that's not the message that they want to promote right now because they have their own agenda. And so that's what I'm saying. It's like when people come at you saying they're going to solve America's problems, look at who's endorsing them. Look at, you know, if they're getting their support from the elites and their enemies are all on the working class side, oh, that's interesting. You know, that should raise some real suspicions right there. So Black Lives Matter Incorporated, Ibram X. Marxist Spot Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, people like that. Yeah, they're not good people. They're race grifters. They're all about just fucking people over for their own personal, private profit and prestige. Fuck them, you know. But we as a culture, we need to move towards conscientiously more of what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned with his I Have a Dream speech. So whatever, you know, if you're out there and you think, oh, you're just a white guy, that of course you would say that. Well, okay, take that with a grain of salt, but then explain to me why it is that the elite white people are promoting Black Lives Matter Incorporated, Dr. Ibram X. Marxist Spot Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, you know, Black Lives Matter Incorporated, all that. Why they're promoting and endorsing them, and why they're demonizing working class whites. You know, why any movement that gets a lot of support from working class whites is automatically, oh, fascist, racist, white supremacist, alt-right. I mean, case in point, the Proud Boys. You just heard that so many times, they're racist. I just thought, okay, sure, they must be racist. I didn't even question it. I just heard it enough times, and I was like, you know, okay, I just assumed they're probably one of those groups that, you know, racial realists or whatever they call themselves, where they're like promoting a white supremacy agenda, right? So I heard that about the Proud Boys, and then I see an article in the BBC about the Proud Boys, and the picture shows a black guy. I'm like, why are they showing a picture of a black guy dressed in paramilitary gear, and it's a story about Black Lives Matter? And then it identified the guy in the picture, Enrique Torres, as the national president of the Proud Boys. Oh, now that's interesting. A black guy who's, you know, got some Cuban ancestry, so he's a Afro-Cuban, as you might say, black and Hispanic. So this guy is the president of a white supremacist organization? Really? What kind of white supremacist organization is this? Is this like Clayton Bigsby from the Chappelle Show? You know, the black, blind, white supremacist guy? No. I mean, it's just bullshit. They just come up with stuff. They just tell you lies. Don't believe your eyes. Oh, it's mostly peaceful protest. Yeah, there's buildings burning down behind me, but it's mostly peaceful protest. Right? It's just dead. Don't believe your eyes. And then if you question us, we're going to say, of course we're not lying to you. You're imagining it, gaslight the shit out of you. Yeah, so anyway, bottom line, fuck the race grifters. Robin DiAngelo, choke on the next fucking corporate dick you suck, you sorry fucking bitch. Ibram X marks the spot, Kendi. You lying sack of fucking shit. That dude, yeah. Hope he chokes on the next corporate dick he sucks as well. Black Lives Matter Incorporated, Patrisse Cullors, she's a lesbian, so hopefully she chokes on the next dildo she shoves down her throat. You know, and her, you know, the jetted tubs in the master bedroom suite of her fucking $6.5 million mansion in the Beverly Hills or wherever it is. All the ritzy neighborhoods where she lives next to the so-called oppressors. Yeah, she really is convinced that elite white people are, that privileged white people are the problem when she wants to live next door to them and fraternize with them and all that, right? No, fuck all those people. They're just out for themselves. They're liars. They're con men. You know, instead, go for the people who really want to help people, you know. Listen to, Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. Those guys don't seem to be in it to make a shit ton of money, you know. They seem to be really motivated by a desire for truth and improving people's lives. They have some credibility. Listen to what they have to say. They're black. They've lived through a lot of things, seen a lot of things. Their perspectives matter, you know. If you want to elevate melanin voices or, you know, platform, you know, increase black voices, listen to those guys too. Listen to your Candace Owens. Not saying I agree with everything she says. She is kind of an ideologue, you know, but she's got her own lived experience and she's got her own set of ideas that she believes, you know. I mean, if we're going to listen to Ibram X marks the spot Kendi, why does he and he alone get to speak on behalf of Black America, but Candace Owens, Larry Elder, John McWhorter, Tom Sheridan Williams, those guys don't? They're not authentically black enough, and so you don't have to listen to them to understand Black America. But you listen to Robin DiAngelo, who's not even black, telling you about what black people need? Come on, man. Get the fuck out of here. So anyway, tune out the race grifters. Recognize race is a bullshit biological category. Move toward a future in which we're not obsessing over race and in which instead it's the content of your character that matters, your beliefs, and not your skin color or your racial ancestry or whatever. That's the way forward. So anyway, thank you very much. Again, I put some links in the show notes. Click on those links if you're so inclined. Help support the podcast, you know. There's a reading list. I'm going to talk about that in a future episode as well. There's also if you want a podcast, you want to make your voice heard, maybe you're thinking about that, you can get 2 free months with Libsyn. Sign up.libsyn.com with promo code Daniel D, or just use a link in the show notes. Anyway, I'm Daniel D with the What's Wrong with America podcast, Season 3, Episode 2, entitled, Why Do the Elites Want a Race War? Well, I think that's why, but let me know what you think. Hey, comment, you know, if this is, of course, subscribe to the podcast. You know, it's available to your favorite podcast apps or whatever. You know, if you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook or whatever, comment by all means. You know, join the group for the page for What's Wrong with America. Anyway, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoy it. God bless y'all. God bless America and the working class people of America who really are the ones who make America great. Thanks a lot and have a good one.